Hi there, as you know it's Home Bible Fellowship Week and we're going to be looking this week at the passage from the last two Sundays, so most of Hebrews chapter 9. Before we dive in, I've got a wee starter question for you to discuss. Just go around your group and share just one thing that you're going to be doing this week. Maybe you're on holiday, with it being the October holidays, or maybe it's just a normal week, but share one thing that you'll be doing this week. It could be a run-of-the-mill normal thing, maybe it's a highlight of your week, or maybe it's a thing in your week that you're not looking forward to at all. But share one thing that you're doing this week just to get started, and do it because we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Now that you've had a bit of a chat, it's time to get our Bibles opened. We've been looking at Hebrews chapter 9 these last couple of weeks, and we've worked all the way through up to verse 22. So what I'd like you to do is just read Hebrews chapter 9 verse 1 to 22. Hebrews 9, 1 to 22. If you remember back to 2 weeks ago, we started this chapter and we said that knowing the old, having information about the old, helps us to better understand the new. I gave the analogy of the rugby. If you know Scotland have never beaten the All Blacks, then when they do, it becomes that bit more significant. And as we look at the Old Covenant, it helps us to understand and see even more the significance of the new. And as we looked at the Old, there were three things that we brought out. We said we saw the God that we need. We saw the God who is holy. And we saw the God who makes a way. So I've got a question for you on each of those different things that we saw that first week looking at this chapter. First of all, how do you need God? Now ultimately we need Him in salvation, and we're going to come to that as we work through. But what situations, scenarios are happening in your life this now where you need God? Secondly, we saw that God is holy. We saw it in the way that the tabernacle was set up, the rules, the regulations that were there for the high priest to go into the most holy place, and how all of that worked. But let's have a chat. How do we see God's holiness? How do we see it in the passage? But how is God's holiness demonstrated in your life? In your actions, how do they show the holiness of God? And then we came on to God making a way. And maybe just chat through from the Old Covenant how God did make a way before we come on to the second half of the passage. So three things to look at and three questions that will be on the screen now. So on Sunday just past, we went into the second half of the chapter, verses 11 to 22. And we saw that Jesus is far superior to the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant could make the people clean ceremonially. They could come, they could offer sacrifice, they could have their sin atoned for. But ultimately, it was laid aside, it was covered over. But when Jesus came, remember our passage starts, but Jesus. When Jesus comes, everything is different. So first of all, discuss, well, what does it mean for Jesus to bring us to God? What did Jesus do that allows us to come to God? What is the cost for Jesus? I know it's a question we might be familiar with, but just remind ourselves of the magnitude of what Jesus has done in order that you and I can be brought close to God. We finished off on Sunday morning by thinking, well, if we are saved, well, so what? What are we saved for? What are we saved to? We saw that through Jesus' death, we become part of God's family. We saw that we're given, it's called a good thing that we're given, or an eternal inheritance. These are things we're given, what we get in Jesus now and in the future. We're part of God's family. What does it mean for you to be part of God's family? What stands out when we talk about that? What does that bring to mind? And What is the reality of being a part of God's family? But finally, as part of God's family, the passage says in verse 14 that we're called away from dead works to serve the living God. And I want you to get really practical here. Think, what does it mean to serve God? What does it look like in your life day by day? And this is where I want you to go back to the start of our time together. You shared something you're going to be doing this week. And maybe use that as something to think, how am I going to serve God in this thing that I'm doing this week? What's that going to look like on the ground? Because it's great having it in our head, yes, I'm going to serve God. But what does that actually look like? What are the nuts and bolts of it? And then, as you finish, come to prayer. Pray together, remembering that God is holy. Pray together, remembering God is the one whom we need. Pray thanking God that we can come through Jesus. And pray asking God to help you to serve Him as a member of His family. Have a great week, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.